I thought it was just another job, an easy paycheck for watching over some old books during the night. Aveline Library sounded quaint, maybe even peaceful. But the moment I stepped inside, I realized I was wrong. The place feels alive. The shadows are too long, the aisles stretch farther than they should, and the silence isn't empty, it's watching. Then there are the rules. Never read aloud. Never enter the basement. Never look at the watchers. They seemed ridiculous until the clock chimed 13 and something shifted in the darkness. Now, I'm trapped in a maze of forbidden books, shifting corridors, and creeping figures that shouldn't exist. Every rule I break brings me closer to them, and closer to the truth about this place. There's one last rule that haunts me. Never leave before dawn. But what if dawn never comes? Taking the night shift at Aveline Library wasn't my first choice. It wasn't even my fifth, but grad school doesn't pay for itself. The online listing sounded decent. Quiet hours, easy work, and most importantly, a steady paycheck. I'd imagined it as a cozy gig. You know me, books, a little coffee on the side. Peaceful. Instead, I found myself standing in front of the library's looming stone facade, clutching my jacket against the biting autumn wind, wondering why the place felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary of knowledge. The doors groaned as I pushed them open, and the smell of old paper hit me, warm, slightly musty, and oddly sweet. The interior was cavernous, with shelves that seemed to stretch forever and ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. Dim sconces cast flickering light, leaving corners and aisles shrouded in darkness. Rachel Green? A voice cut through the silence, making me jump. I turned to see a tall, thin woman standing near the desk, her stern face partially illuminated by a desk lamp. She looked like she'd been carved from stone herself. Sharp features, gray streaks in her dark hair, and the sort of posture that made you want to apologize for existing. This had to be Mrs. Delaney, the manager. "Yes, that's me," I said, straightening up. Her eyes flicked over me, disapproving but resigned. "You're on time. That's something." Without another word, she handed me a small stack of papers. "Sign these. Aveline Library takes its policies seriously." I skimmed the forms. A basic NDA, a liability waiver, and a sheet that looked like rules. "Mrs. Delaney noticed my confusion. Those are for your protection. Follow them, and you'll have no trouble here." I glanced at the first few rules. Never read aloud from any book found on the 4th floor. If you hear whispering, do not turn around. Avoid the basement at all costs. "Is this the joke?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Her expression didn't change. "It's not. You'll understand soon enough." Before I could press her, she motioned for me to follow. "I'll show you the office." The security office was tucked behind a heavy oak door in the far corner of the library. It was cramped, with a single desk, a chair, and a series of old monitors showing grainy black and white feeds of various library sections. A small clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound in the oppressive silence. "This will be your station," Mrs. Delaney said, her tone curt. "Check the cameras periodically, keep the shelves tidy, and stay alert." "Alert for what?" I asked, half joking. "Marauding library card thieves?" She didn't laugh. "The rules," she said simply. "They're not suggestions, Miss Green." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed her seriousness or her sanity. "Your shift ends at dawn. Do not leave before then." She stepped back toward the door. "And Rachel, whatever happens, stay out of the basement." Before I could ask more, she disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone in the dimly lit office. I glanced at the list of rules again, my skepticism giving way to unease. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she'd said them, like she knew something I didn't. The first hour passed quietly. I spent it wandering the aisles, marveling at the library's size and its endless collection of books. Most of them were ancient, bindings cracked, titles faded. I shelved a few misplaced volumes and even dusted a neglected shelf, trying to keep busy. But the silence was heavy. Every sound I made, the squeak of my shoes, the shuffle of a book, felt too loud, like I was disturbing something. The dim lighting didn't help either. Shadows stretched across the floor, twisting and bending in ways that made me shiver. I returned to the office to check the cameras, telling myself it was just nerves. The monitors flickered as I flipped through the feeds. The main lobby, the restricted section, the children's area. All empty, all still. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was just a library. Nothing to be scared of. It was around midnight when I heard it. Faint whispering, just loud enough to catch my attention. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the old pipes, but as I walked toward the sound, it grew clearer. Words I couldn't make out. Voices just behind me. I froze. My skin prickled as the rules echoed in my head. If you hear whispering, do not turn around. For a moment, I thought about breaking the rule. Maybe it was just Mrs. Delaney trying to scare me. Or maybe some college kids had snuck in for a laugh. But something deep in my gut warned me not to look. I clenched my fists and forced myself to move forward, ignoring the growing urge to glance over my shoulder. The whispering faded as I reached the restricted section. The restricted section was cordoned off by a velvet rope. Most of the books inside were locked behind glass cases, though one stood out immediately. A golden book on a pedestal, its cover shining faintly in the dim light. I didn't need a rule to tell me not to touch it. There was something about it that felt wrong, like it was watching me. My stomach churned, and I backed away, suddenly eager to return to the office. Back in the office, I checked the cameras again. The restricted section was empty. No golden glow, no whispering voices. I laughed nervously, rubbing my temples. I was being ridiculous. Sleep deprivation and nerves, that's all it was. The clock on the wall ticked softly, but the sound seemed louder now, more insistent. Midnight came and went, and I thought I might actually get through the night without incident. Then, at 12:13, the clock chimed. Once, twice, 13 times. My heart stopped. That wasn't possible. I checked the cameras again, scanning the feeds for any sign of movement. The children's area, the lobby, the restricted section. Nothing. But when I flipped to the feed showing the main aisles, I saw them. Figures. Tall, shadowy, and still, standing between the shelves. They weren't there before. I blinked, hoping they'd disappear, but they didn't move. They didn't vanish. They just stood there, waiting. The rules flashed through my mind. Stay alert. Follow the rules. Stay out of the basement. It was going to be a long night. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. The figures stood motionless between the aisles, their tall, indistinct forms blending with the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped to another camera angle, hoping the figures were a glitch or a trick of the light. But on every feed, they were there silent, waiting. Okay, I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. You're just tired and jumpy. The rules echoed in my mind. Check the cameras periodically, but don't stare for too long. I forced myself to look away, letting the monitor screens flicker in the corner of my vision. It was harder than I thought. Part of me wanted to keep watching, to make sure they didn't move. But the longer I stared, the more I felt something. A pull, like the figures weren't just standing there, but looking back at me. I clenched my fists and turned my attention to the desk, pretending the stack of paperwork there was the most interesting thing in the world. The ticking clock seemed louder now, each second dragging me closer to the edges of my nerves. I decided to take a walk. Sitting in that cramped office, surrounded by the flickering monitors and the ever-present clock, was starting to make me feel claustrophobic. Besides, I figured a patrol would help clear my head. Maybe those figures were just shadows after all, and seeing the aisles for myself would prove it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkened corridor. The library was colder than I remembered, the faint hum of electricity filling the silence. My footsteps echoed softly on the marble floor as I approached the main aisles. The air here felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I shone my flashlight down the rows of books, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing moved. No figures. Just shelves and shelves of dusty tomes. Relief washed over me, and I almost laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, whispering. This time, it was closer, more insistent, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the rules pounding in my head. If you hear whispering, "Do not turn around." It was almost impossible not to look. Every instinct screamed at me to whip around, to confront whoever or whatever was behind me. But I forced myself to keep walking, my steps quick and deliberate. The whispering followed me, growing louder with each step, until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood, trying to keep myself from running. Something told me that running would be a mistake. So I walked, one foot in front of the other, until the whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started. I didn't stop to question it. I kept moving until I reached the restricted section. The restricted section was even creepier in person than it looked on the cameras. The velvet rope felt more like a barrier keeping things in than keeping people out, and the glass cases gleamed faintly in the dim light. And there it was, the golden book. It sat on its pedestal, glowing faintly, as if it were calling to me. The urge to touch, it was almost overwhelming. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The rules didn't say anything about the golden book directly, but every instinct told me it was dangerous. Still, my curiosity burned. What was it doing here? Why wasn't it locked up like the others? Before I realized it, my hand was inches from the book. I wasn't even sure how I'd move, but there I was, fingers trembling as they hovered over the ornate cover. The moment I brushed the surface, the temperature dropped. A sharp, icy wind seemed to rush through the library, ruffling the pages of the books on the shelves. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stupid," I muttered to myself, stepping away from the pedestal. So stupid. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the aisles. I didn't need any more warnings. I backed away from the restricted section, almost tripping over the velvet rope in my hurry. By the time I got back to the office, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and collapsed into the chair, struggling to catch my breath. The cameras flickered as I cycled through the feeds again, scanning for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. One of the figures, the tall, shadowy ones I'd seen before, was closer. It stood at the edge of an aisle, partially hidden by a bookshelf. It hadn't been there when I left the floor. My stomach churned as I flipped to another feed. Another figure stood by the children's area, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. They weren't shadows. They were moving. I clutched the arms of the chair, willing myself to stay calm. Don't engage. Don't panic. Just follow the rules. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and for a moment, I thought I heard it skip a beat. I glanced at the time, 12:47 a.m., but something about it didn't feel right. I could have sworn it was already later than that. I pulled out the list of rules Mrs. Delaney had given me, scanning them again. The next one caught my eye. If the time seems earlier than it should be, return to the office immediately. I was already here, but the wording gnawed at me. What did it mean? The only thing I could do was stay put and hope dawn came quickly. I didn't notice the basement door until it was already open. I hadn't heard it creak or slam. It was just there, a gaping black maw at the end of the hallway outside the office. My blood turned to ice as I stared at it, the memory of the rule flashing in my mind. Avoid the basement at all costs. The door shouldn't have been there. When I started my shift, there had been nothing but a solid wall. I knew that, and yet, there it was, beckoning me with its impossible presence. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it down the hall, half expecting the door to vanish like a mirage. But it stayed. The edges of the doorway seemed to ripple, like the darkness beyond wasn't empty but alive. For a moment, I was tempted to step closer, not out of curiosity this time, but out of something deeper, a pull. It was the same feeling I'd had with the Golden Book, but stronger, more insistent. I took a shaky step back, then another, until I was safely inside the office. I locked the door and forced myself to focus on the monitors. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I stayed glued to the screens, watching the shadowy figures shift and flicker across the cameras. They never moved when I looked directly at them, but every time I changed angles, they were closer. At one point, I saw a figure standing outside the office door. It didn't knock or try to open the door. It just stood there, still and silent, as if waiting for something. The clock ticked on, and the minutes felt like hours. By the time dawn broke, the figures had vanished, and the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift. But I knew this wasn't over. I'd survived my first night. Barely. And something told me the worst was yet to come. When I returned to Aveline Library the following night, the world outside seemed different, as if the colors were muted and the air heavier. I told myself it was just my frayed nerves, but the thought didn't stick. Something about this place had a way of clinging to you, even when you weren't there. The doors groaned open again, and the musty scent of old paper enveloped me. The dim lighting seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. I stepped inside and paused at the desk, waiting for Mrs. Delaney. But the office was empty. No sign of her. I glanced at the visitor log and noticed something odd. Her name was signed, dated earlier that evening. My name was written too, but I hadn't touched the pen. The shift started quietly enough. I shelved a few stray books, straightened a display table near the entrance, and made a quick lap of the first floor. The silence felt heavier tonight, like it was pressing down on me, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The restricted section drew my attention as I passed it, but I forced myself to look away. I wasn't going near that golden book again, not after last night. My fingers still tingled when I thought about touching it, the way the library had seemed to come alive in that instant. The clock in the main hall chimed softly as I made my way back to the security office. Midnight. The second night was officially underway. I wasn't planning to break the rules. I wasn't even planning to bend them. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when it whispers louder than fear. It started when I noticed the golden book again, glowing faintly on its pedestal in the restricted section. It wasn't just glowing, it was pulsing like a heartbeat. I tried to ignore it, but the more I watched the cameras, the more it seemed to draw my attention. Finally, I gave in. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the restricted section, my footsteps echoing faintly on the tiled floor. The velvet rope felt colder tonight, and when I stepped over it, the air seemed to shift. The shadows around me deepened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my flashlight sweeping over the shelves, but nothing was there. I turned my attention to the book. It was beautiful, more than I remembered. Ornate gold filigree, intricate patterns etched into the cover. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched it again. This time I opened it. The pages were blank at first, just smooth, pristine paper. But as I flipped through, words began to appear, scrawled in a handwriting that wasn't mine. Names, dates, each page filled with them, the ink bleeding as if freshly written. And then I saw it. My name? Rachel Green. Beneath it was today's date, followed by nothing. The line seemed to wait for something else, the ink bleeding faintly at the edges as if impatient. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. The library seemed to groan around me, the shelves shifting faintly in the dim light. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I ran. I hadn't noticed the basement door on my way back to the office. It was just there, yawning open like a black hole at the end of the hallway. My stomach churned as I stared at it, the rules hammering in my mind. Avoid the basement at all costs. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. Something about the door was magnetic, pulling me closer with every step. My flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness beyond, but I could hear things. Soft shuffling, distant whispers, the faint creak of wood. I stepped closer, my breathing shallow. The stairs descended into the void, the edges of each step barely visible. My hand tightened on the railing as I took a single step down, then another. The air grew colder, sharper, until it felt like needles against my skin. I stopped when I heard it, a low, guttural sound like breathing, but wrong. It was wet and heavy, coming from somewhere deep below. My stomach twisted, and I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Back in the office, I checked the cameras, expecting to see the figures from the night before. But the aisles were empty. The silence stretched on, heavier with each passing second. I pulled out the list of rules and scanned them again, desperate for reassurance. That's when I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a new rule. If you encounter another person who isn't on the night shift, ask them to recite today's date. If they hesitate or get it wrong, run. My heart sank. How had the list changed? I didn't remember it saying anything about other people. Was I going insane? A knock at the office door jolted me from my thoughts. "Hey, Rachel, it's me." The voice was calm, familiar. "Mrs. Delaney. Forgot to tell you something." I froze, my mind racing. I glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be here, and yet her name was in the log. I hesitated, then grabbed the list of rules. Ask them to recite today's date. My throat tightened as I approached the door. "What's today's date?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was a pause. Too long. When she finally answered, it was wrong, off by 2 days. "Open the door," she said, her tone shifting. "You're breaking the rules, Rachel." I stepped back, my hands shaking. "Go away." The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The rest of the night spiraled into chaos. The figures appeared on the monitors again, closer than before. I watched as one of them tilted its head, almost as if it were listening. The golden book's glow appeared on every camera feed, even in places it shouldn't have been. And the basement door? It stayed open no matter how many times I locked it. The worst part was the clock. It chimed 13 again, and this time, the time on the monitors began to rewind. Midnight, 11:45 p.m., 11:30 p.m. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my pulse racing. The library wasn't just alive, it was playing with me. When dawn finally came, the tension lifted as if a switch had been flipped. The figures disappeared, the basement door closed, and the golden book stopped glowing. But the damage was done. The rules had changed, the library had shifted, and I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to survive another night if I didn't figure out what this place wanted. The third night was colder. I could feel it in the air as soon as I crossed the threshold into Aveline Library. The place seemed darker than it had been before, the shadows sharper, the silence deeper. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, and it felt like the walls themselves were listening. I didn't want to come back. After the second night, the whispers, the glowing book, the thing pretending to be Mrs. Delaney, I spent most of the day convincing myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't return, the library would come for me. As I entered the security office, the door creaked louder than usual. I paused to glance at the clock. Midnight sharp. The cameras flickered to life, their grainy feeds bathing the room in a sickly glow. The rules were still on the desk, exactly where I'd left them. My heart sank as I saw yet another line had appeared at the bottom of the page. If the keeper speaks to you, do not answer. The first hour passed in uneasy silence. I followed the routine as best I could, patrolling the aisles, checking the cameras, keeping my head down. But I could feel something watching me more intensely than before. The air felt heavier, the faint hum of electricity louder. I was about to return to the office when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the central aisle, just barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought he was another shadowy figure like the ones I'd seen before. But as I stepped closer, I realized this was different. The keeper was tall, easily 7 feet, and impossibly thin, his limbs too long, his fingers too sharp. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his gaze on me. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. I froze, the list of rules flashing in my mind. Do not answer. Rachel. His voice was soft but piercing, as if it had bypassed my ears and gone straight to my thoughts. You shouldn't be here. My throat tightened. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Do you know what you've done? I clutched the flashlight, my knuckles white. He knew. He knew about the book, the basement, the rules I'd broken. The weight of his presence pressed down on me, suffocating. Do you think the library will let you leave now? His voice was almost mocking, but there was something darker beneath it, something hungry. I turned and walked away, my legs shaking with every step. The rules didn't say I had to run. They only said not to answer. By the time I made it back to the office, my pulse was racing. The keeper didn't follow me, but his voice lingered in my head, a gnawing whisper that wouldn't let go. I flipped through the camera feeds, trying to reassure myself that the library was empty. But when I cycled to the restricted section, my stomach turned. The golden book was gone. In its place was something new, a black journal, its cover worn and frayed. It hadn't been there earlier, and I hadn't seen anyone enter the restricted section. My hands trembled as I adjusted the camera angle, but the image stayed the same. The journal was waiting for me. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to touch another cursed book. But the pull was stronger this time, and a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this might be my only chance to understand the library's secrets. The walk to the restricted section felt longer than it should have. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows warping with each step. By the time I reached the velvet rope, I was shaking. The black journal sat on the pedestal, unassuming yet menacing. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the cover. The room seemed to hold its breath as I opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, messy and hurried. It wasn't like the Golden Book. This one was personal, almost frantic. I flipped to the first page and saw a name, Eleanor Delaney. Mrs. Delaney? My breath caught as I skimmed the entries. They detailed nights in the library, the same as mine, whispers, shadowy figures, the keeper. The library is testing me. Every rule broken invites it closer. I flipped further, scanning for anything that might explain what was happening. Then I found it. The library chooses its keepers. Those who break too many rules don't leave. They become part of the library. The words blurred as my hands began to tremble. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. I stared at it, my mind racing. The sound of the clock broke through my thoughts. It wasn't a soft chime this time. It was a booming, resonant echo that seemed to shake the entire building. 13 strikes. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. I grabbed the journal and ran, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The office was my only refuge now. If the library was coming for me, it would have to find me there. The monitors flickered to life as I slammed the door behind me. The black journal sat on the desk, its pages open to a single line. The keeper is watching. Do not look at him. I glanced at the cameras. The keeper was standing outside the office door. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, his hooded face staring directly at the camera. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the monitor, my breath shallow. The clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m. The lights flickered again, plunging the office in a momentary darkness. When they came back on, the keeper was gone from the feed. But the black journal had more to say. The words seemed to write themselves, ink bleeding onto the page as I watched. The lights will go out. When they do, stay absolutely still. If you move, he will see you. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. As if on cue, the lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back. The darkness was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, the sound deafening in the silence. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching the flashlight in my trembling hands. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the office door. Then the knob turned, a soft creak that sent chills down my spine. The rules echoed in my mind. Stay still. Stay silent. The door opened. I could feel him there, standing just feet away, his presence heavy and cold. My lungs burned as I held my breath, willing myself not to move. The footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. The lights flickered back on. When I finally looked at the journal again, the final page had been written. He is testing you, Rachel. Follow the rules, and you might survive. Break them, and you will take my place. The last line wasn't written in ink. It was carved into the paper, deep enough to tear through the pages. You're already his. I didn't sleep after the third night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the keeper, standing outside the office door waiting. The words in the black journal played on a loop in my mind. Follow the rules, and you might survive. Break them, and you will take my place. What did it mean? Take his place? The journal had hinted at the truth, but I didn't have all the pieces. Not yet. If I was going to survive, I had to understand what this place was and why it had chosen me. The fourth night began like the others. The library's oppressive silence wrapped around me the moment I stepped inside. The shadows seemed darker tonight, deeper, and the air carried a chill that bit through my jacket. The basement door was open again. I stood at the edge of the yawning black void, clutching my flashlight. Every instinct told me to turn back, to stay in the office where it was safe. But something was different tonight. The pull was stronger, more insistent, as if the library itself was daring me to descend. The journal's words echoed in my head. The library chooses its keepers. Was this my test? I stepped onto the first stair, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press closer, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. The stairs spiraled downward, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the oppressive silence. At the bottom, the space opened into a cavernous room lined with shelves. These weren't like the ones upstairs. These were crude, made of rough-hewn wood, and sagged under the weight of leather-bound journals. Hundreds of them. I picked one at random, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The pages were filled with names and dates scrawled in shaky handwriting. Some entries were short, just a name and a single line. He didn't follow the rules. Others were longer, detailed accounts of nights spent in the library. Accounts like mine. The journal I was holding ended abruptly. The last page was smeared with ink, as if the writer had been interrupted. I flipped to the next journal on the shelf, desperate for answers. This one was older, its pages brittle and yellowed. The name on the first page caught my eye, Eleanor Delaney. My stomach churned as I skimmed her entries. She'd been the manager of the library decades ago, tasked with maintaining order during the lost hours. But she hadn't been just a manager. She'd been the keeper before me. The keeper is the library's enforcer, she'd written. A prisoner bound to its rules. Those who fail the test take their place. My breath hitched as the truth sank in. The keeper wasn't just a malevolent entity. He was a person, someone who had once stood where I was, facing the same impossible choices. Someone who had failed. The final entry was short. The library is alive. It chooses, and it never lets go. I slammed the journal shut and stumbled backward, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The library had been testing me from the beginning, watching my every move, waiting for me to break the rules. And I had, again and again. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern, slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the noise. The keeper stood at the edge of the shelves, his hooded face obscured, his two long limbs casting distorted shadows on the walls. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "You've come far." I took a step back, my heart racing. The rules flashed in my mind. Do not answer. Do not engage. "I was like you once," he continued, ignoring my silence. "Curious. Foolish. The library doesn't forgive curiosity." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you understand what this place is? What it wants?" I clutched the flashlight, my knuckles white. "It wants stories," I whispered before I could stop myself. The keeper tilted his head, his hood shifting just enough to reveal a glimpse of something pale and sharp beneath. "Yes," he said, his voice almost amused. "It feeds on them, but stories need an author. A keeper." The keeper's words hung in the air as he reached into the shadows and pulled out a journal. My journal. Its cover was already worn, its pages filled with words I hadn't written yet. "This is your test," he said, holding the journal out to me. "Write your story." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What happens if I don't?" His grin was sharp and terrible. "Then you join the shelves." I hesitated, my hands trembling as I took the journal. The moment my fingers touched the cover, the air grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to close in. The keeper stepped back, melting into the darkness, leaving me alone with the book. I opened the journal, the blank pages staring back at me. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The pen in my hand felt heavier than it should have, its tip poised over the first page. "Write your story." The words came unbidden, spilling onto the page in shaky, uneven lines. I wrote about the first night, the whispering, the figures in the aisles. I wrote about the golden book and the way it seemed to pulse with life. I wrote about the basement, the journals, and the keeper. As I wrote, the library seemed to shift around me, its walls closing in, its air growing colder. The shadows deepened, and the shelves seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness. But the more I wrote, the lighter the air became. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight lifted. When I finally reached the last page, my hand trembling, I paused. One line remained unwritten. The final rule. The pen hovered over the page, my mind racing. If I wrote the final rule, would it set me free? Or would it bind me to this place forever? The keeper's voice echoed in my head. Write your story. I gritted my teeth and pressed the pen to the paper. The words came slowly, painfully, each stroke of the pen dragging me closer to the end. If you survive your test, leave before dawn. If you fail, the library will keep you. The journal snapped shut, and the library groaned around me, the walls trembling as if in protest. The flashlight in my hand flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. When the light returned, I was standing at the library's entrance. The basement door was gone, and the journals were nowhere to be seen. The clock on the wall read 5:47 a.m. I didn't wait. I ran. The cold air hit me like a wave as I stepped outside, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. My chest heaved as I stumbled onto the sidewalk, the weight of the library's test still pressing on my shoulders. I glanced back at the building, half expecting to see the keeper watching me from the shadows. But the windows were dark, the doors silent. In my hands, I still held the journal. Its cover was blank now, but I could feel the weight of its contents. My story, written in ink and blood. The library had let me go, but I knew it wasn't over. Not really. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the spine of the journal. A single line of text, etched in gold. Rachel Green, the new keeper. The journal sat heavy in my lap as I drove home, its blank cover gleaming faintly in the soft morning light. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to, my knuckles white as I navigated the quiet streets. The library was behind me now, but its presence lingered like a shadow, curling around my thoughts. I should have been relieved, ecstatic even, but I wasn't. The etched words on the journal's spine haunted me. Rachel Green, the new keeper. Was it over? Or had I traded one trap for another? I stumbled into my apartment, the familiar clutter of books and unfinished assignments greeting me like an old friend. I dropped the journal on the kitchen table, as far from me as possible, and collapsed onto the couch. The silence of the library clung to me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window felt too loud, too intrusive. My body ached from exhaustion, but I couldn't close my eyes. I was afraid of what I'd see if I did. Hours passed, the morning bleeding into afternoon. The journal remained untouched on the table, a silent reminder of everything I wanted to forget. I thought about burning it, throwing it in the trash, anything to erase its existence. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't work. The library wasn't something you could run from. It wasn't until nightfall that I finally gathered the courage to open the journal again. My hands trembled as I flipped through its pages, expecting to see my story, my handwriting. But the pages were blank, completely empty. And then the words appeared. They bled onto the page like ink, jagged and uneven. The keeper is never truly free. My breath hitched. The text faded, replaced by another line. You have been chosen. You cannot escape the library story. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. The words confirmed what I'd feared. The library wasn't done with me. The next few days passed in a haze. I didn't return to the library. I couldn't. But it didn't matter. The library had followed me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. Whispers filled the silence at night, soft and insistent, growing louder the longer I tried to ignore them. Even my dreams weren't safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the basement, surrounded by endless shelves of journals, the keeper's voice calling my name. I tried to go back to my routine, but nothing felt real anymore. The world outside seemed dull, lifeless, like a faded photograph. I avoided mirrors, afraid of what I might see. I stopped checking the time, terrified I'd hear the clock chime 13. The journal stayed on the table, untouched, but its presence was suffocating. On the third night after I'd left the library, there was a knock at my door. I froze, my pulse racing. The knock came again, louder this time. My mind raced through the rules, even though I wasn't at the library anymore. If someone knocks, check the cameras, confirm their identity. But this wasn't the library. I didn't have cameras. I barely had the courage to approach the door. Rachel, a voice called. It was familiar, but wrong. "It's me, Mrs. Delaney." My chest tightened. I hadn't seen her since my first night at the library, and something about her voice made my skin crawl. It was too smooth, too practiced, like she was trying to sound human. "Go away," I said, my voice trembling. The knock stopped. Silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of retreating footsteps. But instead, I heard her voice again, closer this time. "You can't ignore it forever, Rachel. The library always collects." I didn't sleep that night. The journal sat on the table like a ticking bomb, its cover gleaming faintly in the dim light. The library was calling to me, pulling at the edges of my mind, and I knew I couldn't run from it any longer. As dawn approached, I opened the journal one last time. The pages filled with text as soon as I touched them, instructions written in my own handwriting. Return to the library. Finish the story. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. I knew what I had to do. The library was waiting for me when I arrived, its looming facade darker than I remembered. The doors creaked open without me touching them, and the musty scent of old paper washed over me like a wave. The clock in the main hall read 11:57 p.m. I had 3 minutes before the night began. I made my way to the restricted section, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The pedestal where the golden book had once sat was empty now, but the air around it seemed alive, thrumming with an unseen energy. The journal in my hands felt heavier as I stepped closer. I hesitated for only a moment before placing it on the pedestal. The library groaned, its walls trembling as if in protest. The clock began to chime. The chimes echoed through the library, each one louder than the last. By the time the 13th strike rang out, the journal was glowing, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The room filled with whispers, soft at first but growing louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw the keeper standing in the shadows, watching. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the library was still. The journal was gone, and the pedestal was empty. I felt a strange calm settle over me, but it was accompanied by a deep, gnawing emptiness. I looked at my reflection in the glass of a nearby case and froze. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, but it wasn't just exhaustion. Something had changed, something I couldn't name. As I left the library that morning, the sun rising behind me, I glanced back one last time. The words etched into the doorway caught my eye, words I hadn't noticed before. The keeper never leaves. I haven't returned to the library since that night, but it hasn't left me. The whispers follow me wherever I go, soft and insistent, a constant reminder of the story I've written. The journal reappeared on my desk this morning, its blank cover pristine, as if nothing had ever been written inside. But I know better. The library's story isn't over, and neither is mine.